Morning.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. This morning, we're going to be discussing Psalm 22. As I put in the email to you all, Psalm 22 is a psalm which is very prominent in the Christian tradition, at least not being Christian, at least that's my understanding based on my study of the psalm and some very rudimentary knowledge. um, and we'll definitely discuss that. And I suggested that reading the Passion narrative in the Gospels might be a useful way of preparing for this morning's class because there is a way in which it is possible to understand the Passion narratives as being what in Judaism we would call a midrash on Psalm 22, or what you might say more literarily, that Psalm 22 is the ancient underpinning for how one tells the Passion story. And we're going to look at some examples of that as we look at the psalm. Um, Psalm 22 is also connected to some Jewish interpretations, and we're going to talk about that. This psalm really lends itself in some ways to very sort of line by line and like interpretation that connects to a narrative. We'll look at it. We'll see how that plays out. And But Psalm 22 has no significant role, or mostly has no significant role in Jewish liturgy. Um, but it has a very significant role in sort of um, broader Christian culture. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so we'll start as we usually start, just by reading the psalm out loud in Hebrew and then in English translation. And we'll start, before we do any analysis of the content, start with the emotional experience of reading the psalm. What is the sense that you get? How might you use this psalm if you were going to use this psalm in a spiritual context? What state of mind might you be in when you approach this psalm? So we'll read it first in Hebrew. Psalm 22. Lamenetzeach ala yelet hashachar mizmor leDavid. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, rachok mishuati divrei shagati. Elohai, ekra yomam velo ta'aneh v'layla velo dumiyali, v'ata kadosh yoshev tilot Yisrael, v'cha batchu avotenu batchu v'tafalatemo, elecha zaku v'nimlatu, v'cha batchu v'lo boshu. V'anochi tolat v'lo ish, cherpat adam uvizui am, Kol ro'ai yal iguli, yaftiru b'safa yaniu rosh. Gol el Adonai yifaltehu, yatzilehu ki chafetz bo. Ki ata gochi mi baten mavtichi ad shedei imi. Alecha hoshlachti merachem mi beten imi elai ata. Al tirchak mimeni, ki tzara krova, ki ein ozer. Sivavuni parim rabim, abirei bashan kitruni, patzu alai pihem aryeh toref v'shoeg. Kamayim nishpachti, v'hit pardu kol atzmotai, haya libi kidonag names betoch me'ai. Yavesh kacheres kochi, ushoni mudbak mal kochai, v'la'afar mavet tishpeteni. Ki sivavuni kilavim adat mireim hikifuni kari yadai v'raglai. Asaper kol atzmotai hema yabitu yiruvi yichalku v'gadai lahem v'al levushi yapilu goral. V'ata Adonai al tirchak yaluti le'ezrati chusha hatzila mecherev nafshi miyad kelev yichidati. Hoshieni mipi aryeh umikarne remim anitani. Asapra shimcha le'echai betoch kahal ahalaleka. Yirei Adonai halaluhu kol zera Yaakov kabduhu viguru mimenu kol zera Yisrael kilo vazav velo shikatz enut ani velo histir panav mimenu uvishavu al elav shamea. Meitcha tilati bikahal rav nidarai ashalem neged yireav. Yochlu anavim v'yisba'u yihalu Adonai dorshav yechi levavchem la'ad. Yizkeru v'yashuvu el Adonai kol afsei aretz v'yishtachavu lefanecha kol mishpechot goyim ki Adonai hamlucha moshel b'goyim achlu v'yishtachavu kol dishnei eretz lefanav Yichreu kol yordei afar v'nafsho lo chiyah. Zera yavdenu yisupar ladonai lador yavo v'yagidu tzid kato la'am nolad ki asa. And we'll read some of the translations. Again, thinking about what the feeling is of this psalm. To the chief musician upon a Yeleth
Displayed, Rabbi.
a psalm of David. Yes.
It's not displayed.
Oh, yes. That's a good point. Here you go. I forgot to share it with you. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and I am not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in thee, they trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee and were delivered, they trusted in thee and were not confounded. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. But thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breasts. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths, as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Be not thou far from me, O Lord, O my strength, haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation I praise thee. Ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye, the seed of Jacob, glorify him, and fear him, all ye, the seed of Israel. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither hath he hid his face from him. But when he cried unto him, he heard. My praise shall be of thee in the great congregation. I will pay my vows before them that fear him. The meek shall eat and be satisfied. They shall praise the Lord that seek him. Your heart shall live forever. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord. All the kindreds of the nations shall worship before thee. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he is the governor among the nations. They that be fat upon the earth shall eat and worship. All they that go down into the dust shall bow before him, and none shall keep alive his own soul. A seed shall serve him, it shall be accounted to the Lord for a generation. They shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done this. So that's the King James Version. Let's read a more modern approach to the psalm. Here is the New International Version. My God, why have you forsaken me? For the director of music to the tune of the Doe of the Morning, a psalm of David. my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. To you they trusted and were put not to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. Rescue me from the mouth of the lions. Save me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. From you comes the theme of my praise in the great assembly. Before those who fear you, I will fulfill my vows. The poor will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him, those who cannot keep themselves alive. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. So those are two Christian translations. Let's read one Jewish translation, and then we'll start our conversation. Here, I'll read this one. The revised JPS translation that came out this year. For the leader on a Yeleth HaShachar, a psalm of David. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me, and from my anguished roaring? My God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night, and have no respite. But you are the Holy One enthroned, the praise of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you rescued them. To you they cried out, and they escaped. In you they trusted, and were not disappointed. But I am a worm, less than human, scorned by everyone, despised by people. All who see me mock me. They curl their lips, they shake their heads. Let him commit himself to God. Let God rescue him. Let God save him, for God is pleased with him. You drew me from the womb, made me secure at my mother's breast. I became your charge at birth. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls surround me, mighty ones of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths at me like tearing, roaring lions. My life ebbs away, all my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax melting within me. My vigor dries up like a shard. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You commit me to the dust of death. Dogs surround me. Pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. I take the account of all my bones while they look on and gloat. They divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. But you, O Eternal One, be not far off. My strength hasten to my aid. Save my life from the sword, my precious life from the clutches of a dog. Deliver me from a lion's mouth, from the horns of wild oxen. Rescue me. Then I will proclaim your fame to my kin, praise you in the congregation. You who fear God, give praise. All you offspring of Jacob, show honor. Be in dread, all you offspring of Israel. For God did not scorn and did not spurn the plea of anyone lowly. God did not turn away from them. When they cried out, God listened. Because of you, I offer praise in the great congregation. I pay my vows in the presence of God's worshippers. Let the lowly eat and be satisfied. Let all who seek God give praise. Always be of good cheer. Let all the ends of the earth pay heed and turn to God, and the peoples of all nations prostrate themselves before you. For sovereignty is God's, who rules the nations. All those in full vigor shall eat and prostrate themselves. All those at death's door, whose spirits flag, shall bend the knee in submission. Offspring shall serve God. The sovereign's fame shall be proclaimed to the generation to come. They shall tell of the beneficence to people yet to be born, for God has acted. So what's the emotion of this psalm? What jumps out at you? Murray.
I see it as being in the depth of despair, surrounded by enemies and by everything else, without a way out, and the only rescue and turning to a possible redemption is to God, and challenging God based upon past experience and past performance, that this is the time for God to respond to the call of help and need to emerge as the God of the who responds to people who call upon God.
Great. So Murray points out that at the beginning, right, the speaker describes God's history of responding in times of distress, and by the end, there's a very clear prayer, maybe even a certainty that also in this case, God will respond in a time of distress. And in the middle, there is a very long description of what that distress looks like. And it's very bleak, right? The speaker is completely surrounded. Enemies are all around. There seems to be no way out. All right. Nice. Does anyone have any other comment? Yeah, Larry.
I agree, Murray. What's interesting, though, is in the beginning, it's me personally. I am experiencing these terrible events happening to me. Hello? Hello? Am I on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. I individually am experiencing these terrible events. And yes, it does turn to redemption, but the redemption is all the people of the world are going to be helped and saved by what I am suffering. So it seems to be a universal. God will help all people, everyone, and he lays out the different states people will be in. The only place of disagreement is in one of the translations that says those who are dead will also arise, and another one says those who are at death's door will also hear. But in either case, without issues of death and life after death, it's whatever your state, all mankind will be redeemed, somehow connected to my personal suffering.
Nice. Gary.
My reaction was that the description of the distress was so extreme that I wondered if it is more than a personal experience of distress, or whether it's a reflection on some other catastrophe. I mean, I've been thinking, well, maybe this is a reflection on, the Babylonian invasion or something. But there's something in what you sent us that says that it was written before that. So anyhow,
Yeah. Yes. We can date Psalms approximately based on the language itself. And according to scholars, this particular psalm comes is probably pre-exilic, before the destruction of Jerusalem's temple in 586. So that is to say, it is an older psalm, not probably quite as old as King David, but definitely on the older side. We do have some psalms that are post-exilic, meaning, either from Babylonia or after a return, right? You can't have the psalm by the waters of Babylon. We lay down and we wept, unless you've been to Babylon, right? So there's a big range in the dating of the psalms. Yeah. But I hear what you're saying, right? There are some parts of this psalm that feel very personal and individual, and some parts that seem to transcend an individual experience to something more, maybe something that happened to an entire nation, or and certainly at the end, as Larry said, there's a way in which the solution feels very universal, right? It's to everybody, the ending. Okay. So when I was preparing for today, I spent a lot of time in this book, which I actually read last year, The Bible with and Without Jesus. The Bible with and Without Jesus is, the subtitle is How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently, and it's by Amy Jill Levine and Mark Tzvi Bretler. These are the same authors who wrote the Jewish annotated New Testament, which I'll just say this. If you are living in America in the 21st century and you haven't read the New Testament, you should read it, because a lot of aspects of culture, even the phrases that we use, the language of our vernacular, is affected by the Bible and the language of the Bible, and the Christian scriptures are worth reading. And if you haven't read them since college, it might be worth it to open it back up and read it again. And if you do, the text that you should use is the Jewish annotated New Testament, because if you are Jewish and you're reading the New Testament, it's very helpful to read a version that is footnoted with all of the connections to what some Christians call the Old Testament, what might be called the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call Tanakh. That is to say, when Matthew quotes Jesus quoting Deuteronomy, you get a note that reminds you that this is a text from Deuteronomy that Jesus is preaching about. And that's important. And Natalie, you've raised your hand. Did you have something you wanted to say? You have to unmute.
Okay, this sounds like, well, first of all, I want to know who the dogs are that are attacking this person. That's very visceral,
Yeah.
and specific. There must be some group that's doing the attacking so violently that this person or people can't respond on their own. They're not even, they seem they're not even trying to help themselves. They only want God to help them. And that doesn't seem Jewish. You're supposed to help yourself first, with God's help, not only rely on God to save you from whatever situation you're in.
Yeah. Yeah. The psalmist doesn't describe, I tried this and it didn't work, and I tried this and it didn't work, and I tried this and it didn't work. You,
So,
yeah, it feels like you're looking for a list of failed actions that the psalmist tried before the psalmist went and turned to God.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That isn't in this psalm. That's not necessarily, it is not necessarily the case that the psalmist didn't try other things. It's possible that this poem just represents this moment of complete despair, right? I've tried everything and nothing worked, so now I'm turning to God. All right, so let's look at some of the Jewish liturgical uses of Psalm 22, and then we'll turn quickly. There's not very much of that, so we'll be able to quickly turn to what I learned from this book, the Bible with and Without Jesus, and specifically the chapter on Psalm 22, which is a whole, a whole chapter, a whole academic chapter, some 60 pages or something of material on this topic. 40 pages. Yeah, Larry.
The last comment I'd make about this is that the very end of the psalm seems to reveal a confession about the whole thing, that God has done this. God has acted in all this, both the suffering of the individual or the people and the redemption of all people later, that God has acted. It's the act of God, and that he hath done this.
Yeah.
And
Yes. I mean, I do think that the ending is open to possible interpretations, right? That is, it could be that God just enacts the redemption. But it might also be that God enacts both the suffering and the redemption. Yeah, great. So Psalm 22 is recited in the Kabbalistic Ashkenazi tradition, a mystical tradition. Psalm 22 is recited on Purim evening after the reading of the scroll of Esther. And we're going to talk more about this as we look at the interpretations of the psalm. But the preview is where Christian scholars see Psalm 22 as being about the passion of Jesus, about the crucifixion and death of Jesus. The Jewish tradition largely sees this psalm as being about Esther's suffering in the palace of Achashverosh, and also like her people's suffering, and ultimately the redemption at the end of the book of Esther. And we'll look at both of those possibilities. And that is why Psalm 22 is associated with Purim in the Kabbalistic tradition. It isn't our tradition to read Psalm 22 on Purim, although maybe we should. Okay. Verse 2 is associated with the 13 attributes of mercy. So this Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, this is a very famous line that we had talked at some point about how when you're singing Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, right? The 13 attributes of mercy. Some Sidurim include verses that also describe God using those same appellations for God. So it expands. It's like a midrashic expansion of those attributes. And so since it starts with well, Adonai, Adonai, El, on El means God, and is the same word as Eli, my God. So this is a verse that is very closely associated with the third word of that of the 13 attributes. So there are some Sidurim that contain the reference to that third verse, to that verse when reciting those attributes. Verse 4 is quoted in our daily service, Ve'ata kadosh yoshev tilot Yisrael, and it's used to introduce the quote from Isaiah 6:3 that talks about God being the center of holiness. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, right? So the Psalm 22 verse 4 is used to introduce Isaiah 6:3 in our daily service. And it's also alluded to in Shir HaKavod, which is called the Hymn of Glory, or sometimes we refer to it as Anim Zmirot, in the line, Rotzeh be'amo anavim yifaer, yoshev tilot, bam paer. God desires God's people. God glorifies the humble ones. God who sits glorified by their praises. That image of God sitting glorified by their praises is an image drawn from verse 4. The phrase, all you offspring of Jacob show honor, in verse 24 of our psalm, is quoted or used in the Shabbat Zemer, Kol Makadesh Shvi'i, all those who sanctify the seventh day. And there, it's taken completely out of context. What it means to show honor in the context of the song, the Shabbat song, is to show honor to Shabbat, right? Like to keep Shabbos is how the song is reinterpreting the psalm. So when it says all progeny of Jacob will glorify it or will show honor, in the original psalm, it really means to God, show honor to God. But in the context of the Shabbat song, it means show honor to Shabbat. And then similarly, verse 29 is right towards the end, Ki Ladonai Hamlucha Moshe Bogoyim. That is used also in our daily service. After we read Shirat Hayam, after we read the Song of the Sea, in the closing paragraph of that part of the warm-up for our service, we say, Ki Ladonai Hamlucha Moshe Bogoyim, Ve'alu Moshim B'Har Tzion Lishpot et Harisav, V'Hayta Ladonai Hamlucha, V'Haya Adonai Lamelech al Kol Haaretz, V'Yom Ahu Yedonai Echad U'Shmo Echad, right? That is actually an anthology of 3 verses, Psalm 22, verse 29, and then Ovadia and Zechariah, and it's all about God's sovereignty. For sovereignty belongs to Adonai, who rules the nations. Deliverers shall rise up on Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and dominion shall belong to Adonai. Adonai shall be sovereign of all the earth on that day. Adonai shall be one, and the name of God one. That, I think, is a faithful taking of this verse out of context, because they replaced it, they put it in another context where it still is talking about God's sovereignty, and God as God's oneness. And so I do feel like that is more of a literal understanding of the psalm than the Shabbat song that took the phrase completely out of context. All right, so you can see that, there are these 2 verses that are mentioned in our prayer service, and the rest of the psalm is basically ignored by the Jewish tradition, with the exception of the Kabbalistic tradition that reads the psalm as associated with Purim. So let's jump into it. Gary.
I didn't quite get how verse 2 about abandonment is understood in terms of the 13 attributes of mercy. I didn't get the connection between.
It's really just I think, I, it's a good question. The connection or the association is linguistic. It has to do with the word el, the word God. Your point that it seems like a surprising hook, right? Why would we anchor this verse that talks about God's possible abandonment of the people? Why would we hook that into that to the attributes of mercy? I can't give a I can't give a for sure answer to that. I'm not sure why this verse was hooked, but I would say this, which is I think hooking it there offers an answer to the question that opens this psalm, right? God hasn't abandoned us. God treats us with mercy. Or it's a prayer that in the moments that we feel abandoned, God will treat us with mercy. Or it's right, or it's like at the beginning of, we say Adonai, Adonai, El, Rachum v'Chanun, before we get to God's compassion and mercy, before we get to that, we still have to approach God as El, as God. And one of the things that God is distant, and sometimes we have that sense of abandonment, and so hooking this verse in lets us connect to that emotional experience. But like I said, like our Machzor, right? We don't have a lot of extra verses next to the attributes of mercy, right? The people who created our Sidur do not expect that adding in extra intertextual references will be as useful to us, conservative Jews or modern readers, right? Because we don't necessarily know scripture as well and wouldn't necessarily recognize that this is a verse from Psalm 22, right? Like I don't think, anyway, if you pray from a Nusach Sfard Sidur, like a Sidur that sort of comes from that Kabbalistic tradition, it is likely that this verse will be printed at some point, in maybe in a footnote, maybe in small print, maybe in parentheses, connected to the 13 attributes of God. All right. So let's talk about Jesus. It was, I think, right, even if you didn't reread the Passion narrative before this class, there were probably some phrases that jumped out at you and that felt sort of weirdly connected to that moment with Jesus, like pierced my hands and feet, right? Which that's how King James translated it, and that's how the modern Christian translation, the New International Version, translated it as pierced. But the Jewish translation that I read, right, didn't use the word pierced. It used where is that? They maul my hands and feet. Okay. But they pierce seems very clearly crucifixion-y. Then there are some other things that immediately jump out as being connected, like Eli, Eli, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? That phrase is very associated with Jesus on the cross. And let's look at some of the other connections. So, and I do want to preface again by saying I am not a Christian or a Christian scholar, but I'm tried to brush up on my understanding of this. So the entire depiction of Jesus's death on the cross is a riff or a meditation or a midrash, or is based on our poem, Psalm 22, which is a lament psalm which speaks of despair and hope and which grounds the passion narrative. So Mark
Yeah,
15:34. What? Sorry, yes, Mark.
the casting lots for the clothes is definitely from the crucifixion.
Great. Good. Did anybody else? Yeah, Henry.
I had read that Christ spoke this psalm on the cross.
Great. Right.
And as soon as I read that, all I could think of was, is this depicted, well, yes, a movie, but is this depicted in Jesus Christ Superstar, which I found no relation to. I did look it up. But it does have that essence of such power.
Yeah. So, right. Exactly. So the Gospel of Mark in chapter 15, it reads, then about that time, Jesus shouted, Eli, Eli, or Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you deserted me? And is a direct quote from our psalm. And some commentators, some of the Gospels say that means that he said the whole psalm, right? All right, so they took my clothes and gambled for them. All four Gospels depict the Roman soldiers casting lots for Jesus's clothing. So that, as Mark pointed out, that is clearly a part of this. If you're going to tell the Passion story, you're definitely going to talk about the clothes. One thing that's really interesting, right, is John, I didn't put it on the sheet, but John says they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic, and now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it. This was to fulfill what scripture says, they divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. In other words, John chapter 19 literally quotes Psalm 22 to explain why this particular action happened. And you have to understand the Hebrew, right? Because Psalm 22:18 says, they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. And the clothes is plural, like multiple clothes, but clothing is kind of a singular noun that refers to all your clothing or a specific garment of clothing. And so John specifically introduces a separate item of clothing so that both things can be true, that they divided the other clothing among themselves and that they had a specific piece of clothing about which they cast lots, right? And okay, the quote, right? The psalm says, everyone who sees me makes fun and sneers, they shake their heads. Mark and Matthew both report, though those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads, right? The psalm says, our ancestors trusted you and you rescued them. When they cried out for help, you saved them, and you did not let them down when they depended on you. Matthew depicts Jesus' enemies as saying specifically, he trusts in God, let God deliver him. Now, if he wants to, for he said, I am God's son. So then, all right. So now I did quote some things directly from this book. The entire crucifixion narrative could be reconstructed from Psalm 22. Why that psalm in particular? One option is that everything the Gospels report actually happened, from Jesus's thirst to the casting of lots for the garments to the taunters who wagged their heads. All right, so it could be that the psalm existed and then it exactly happened that way, which is how John understands it, right? That is, the Gospel of John imagines that the Roman soldiers were acted in accordance with the sort of prophecy of Psalm 22. So maybe that is true. A second possibility is that Jesus called out Eli or El or Elohai or right or something like that on the cross, and because that was the first word of this psalm, it immediately became associated, because Jesus cried out in that way, the psalm became associated with this moment, and then tellings of what happened were influenced by the psalm. That's the second possibility. A third possibility is that Jesus called out for the prophet Elijah, Eliah, whose name in Hebrew is very similar to Eli. And when you read the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, they mention that Jesus seemed to be calling out to Elijah. And so it's possible that the association with this psalm was based on the sound of the word Elijah being similar to the beginning of this psalm. A fourth suggestion is that Mark, the earliest gospel writer, placed these words on Jesus's lips. That is to say, Jesus had nothing to do with Psalm 22, but Mark associated this moment with Psalm 22, and everybody after Mark agreed. Yes, this is connected to Psalm 22. The Psalm's themes are very connected to the theme of the Passion, which is a sense of being rejected or abandoned on the cross and ultimately redeemed. The earliest rabbinic sources rarely cite Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 is very, very, very sparsely used in Jewish liturgical tradition. Perhaps the rabbis ignored it because it was so significant to early Christians. When Jews began to interpret this psalm, they do so in three main ways: as an explanation of events related to Queen Esther, in reference to King David, like many of the psalms that we've already looked at have been interpreted historically as connected to King David, or in reference to a Messiah other than Jesus. Rabbinic connection of Esther to Psalm 22 has good precedence. So you probably, if you come to synagogue every year on Purim, you're familiar with the story of Esther. What is the most important, what is one of the most important characteristics of the book of Esther as it appears in our tradition? I think I preached about this last year. I mean, not that I'm saying you have to remember my sermons, but I would, whatever. Let's not play guess what the rabbi's thinking. One of the most important aspects of the book of Esther is that the God is not mentioned in the book. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther at all, not even once, right? And the word Esther, which is clearly a cognate of the Babylonian god Ishtar, okay, in Hebrew seems to have the same root as Haster Astir Panai, I will surely hide my face, which is about God's hiddenness, right? God is not obvious in the world. God acts, but in hidden ways. What is so remarkable about the fact that the book of Esther makes it into the Bible without mentioning God even once is that there were other versions of the book of Esther that existed before the Bible was codified, was canonized, and some of the other versions of the book of Esther do have God in it, right? So I think last year I preached on what do you think Esther might have prayed before entering Ahasuerus's throne room? We in our version of the book of Esther, we know that she fasts for 3 days. And in Jewish tradition, fasting is usually accompanied by prayer, but we have no record in our text of the prayer that Esther prays. But the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, the translation of the Tanakh into Greek, the Septuagint does contain Esther's prayer, and it quotes from Psalm 22. Okay, so the association of Esther with Psalm 22 is very, very ancient. Here's a Talmudic aspect, a Talmudic interpretation that gets to this point. The verse states with regard to Esther, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house, right? So that's right before she goes in, right before the king is either going to lower the scepter to her and she's going to live, or she's going to die, right? And she says immediately in the previous verse, if I have to die, I'll die, right? Kasher avadati, right? Like, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do, and who knows if I was put here just for this purpose, right? And the Midrash, as reported here by the Talmud, what did she say when she stood in the inner court and was about to enter into the king's presence? Rabbi Levi said, once she reached the chamber of the idols, which was in the inner court, the divine presence left her, right? So Esther is walking through King Achashverosh's house to get, right, walking through the palace to get to King Achashverosh. And when she goes by this place of idolatry, and God vanishes from her presence. And she immediately says, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani? My God, why have you forsaken me? Perhaps it is because you judge an unintentional sin as one performed intentionally, and an action done due to circumstances beyond one's control as one done willingly. Or perhaps you have left me because in my prayers I called Haman a dog, as it is said, deliver my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog, right? Which is a direct quote from our psalm. She at once retracted and called him in her prayers a lion, as it is stated in the following verse, save me from the lion's mouth, right? So Esther has this experience of being forsaken by God, and maybe her prayer is deeply connected to Psalm 22. And you'll notice that those aspects, the aspect of the dog and the lion, are not the parts of the psalm that the Gospels pick up on, right? The Gospels are really concerned with the scorners and the clothing and the right, but Esther's, like, the rabbis are interpreting other verses from the psalm to ground it to Esther, so that you can say, right, look, this psalm could mean this, or this psalm could mean that, right? And Natalie, I think this sort of answers your question of who is the dog. According to one voice in Jewish tradition, the dog is Haman. So it is likely that such association of Psalm 22 with Esther reflects an anti-Christian polemic. The psalm is about the queen in her distress and not about Jesus on the cross. Conversely, in 398 CE, Jerome, one of the church fathers, insisted that this psalm should not be understood in reference to Mordecai and Esther. He knew what his Jewish neighbors were interpreting, were doing. To this day, ironically, while the book of Esther is read in its entirety on the Jewish holiday of Purim, it plays at best a minor role in Christian lectionaries. That's fascinating to me, right? Like, Christians basically don't read the book of Esther. I mean, liturgically. They might read it because it's interesting to read a book of the Bible that has a female protagonist, but it has a minor role in Christian lectionaries. On the lips of Jesus, the psalm recollects all those who are put to death by the state. On the lips of Esther, the psalm concerns all those who are sexually trafficked. In the Midrash of Psalms, Esther prays, my God, why should the order of the world, even the story of the matriarchs, turn out differently for me, right? And what does she mean there? While God rescued Sarah from Pharaoh's harem in Genesis chapter 12, no one yet had rescued Esther from Achashverosh's harem, right? So as Esther, good Jewish girl like she is, says, how is it possible that I can be in the same situation that Sarah was in, but God would do nothing to help me? No wonder she feels abandoned by God. Psalm 22 becomes the lament of the victim of rape and the forceful voice of the survivor. Today, Psalm 22 is heard in Christian churches on Good Friday. It is still heard in some synagogues in connection with Purim. The psalm allows us to express the feeling that many of us have had, that God has abandoned us. So what do you think about this, these possibilities of interpretation?
Perhaps all are true.
Yeah. Murray.
Well, I'd like to suggest that this plea in desperation can be extended to many events, tragic and catastrophic events in Jewish history, starting with the destruction of the temple and then the scattering of the Jewish people, to the ghettoizing them, to the pogroms, to the battle to the War of Independence, to individual situations where certain leaders or groups were surrounded and had no way out. And this would be a prayer. Why has God abandoned them, and they can only see redemption from God? It has all its many applications. And I think it has, as Lara said, the universal aspect of it can be extended beyond just the Jewish people.
Reverend James, I wanted to invite you to share a reaction or thought, or I acknowledge that your expertise on the passion narrative is greater than my own.
Well, I don't really have much more to add. I think you've covered the use of Psalm 22. You know, it is basically used on Good Friday. It's seen in Christianity as dealing, if not just the words of Jesus, the entire passion. I certainly agree with the authors that you quoted. You know, it certainly has a much greater, if not universal, a much greater application. Because I think it's part of the human condition to feel abandoned sometimes. And it's an honest question, although in a lot of Christian circles, you know, you don't want to ask why God has abandoned you, or even suggest it. But inside, that's the feeling that we have when things get really bad, both personal and I think corporately. So I think it's a much larger psalm than just Christian application, but certainly the early Christians saw it as pertaining to Jesus's, not just the crucifixion, but also the resurrection with the hope at the end of the psalm.
Yeah, and certainly when you read the problem in the psalm, when you read the problem as the crucifixion, then at the end, people not yet born will be told the Lord has saved us, certainly resonates in the sense of that understanding. Yeah, no question. Thank you. Gary, did you have something you wanted to add?
I have heard, but of course, you have to take this with a grain of salt, that an interpretation of Jesus saying that phrase on the cross was that having taken the sins of the world upon himself, that God had to turn away. And that was the sense of abandonment. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think where I heard that.
Yeah. Certainly the psalm itself lends itself to that sense of but I am a worm less than human, right? Like there are aspects where you can see how that might come from the psalm. All right. Thank you, everybody. We are not meeting 1 week from today on the Tuesday the 26th, but we will meet in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, our psalm will be Psalm 23, which is the most famous psalm in the whole book of Psalms. We could probably spend, 5 weeks just on that psalm, but we won't. We'll just do one. But because of its near universal fame, I think we'll probably spend most of our time talking and sharing personal connections and stories about that psalm. My question, it's only 6 verses long, Psalm 23. My question for you to think about over the next 2 weeks is, do you find Psalm 23 comforting, and in what ways do you find Psalm 23 comforting? And if you feel comfortable sharing, I invite you to come to share a time when you were comforted by Psalm 23. We'll definitely look at the words and what they mean, but we're going to spend a lot of time, I think, just on the personal stories and on sharing that sense of comfort from that psalm. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank
you,
you,
everyone.
A happy new year.
Happy New Year.
You.